Delta, the triangle, means change. So this is a good abbreviation. Okay. So we got the mouse population that's living in the desert. In the example, the rock pocket mice. And then they're reproducing. And there are the environment changes, so it ends up with the lava flow. The lava flow dries dark. So how did that end up happening? Because there's like one version of the mouse. What happens in those babies to make them a little bit different?
I believe it's just like genetic mutations and like the actual DNA, just like differences.
Okay, we've got some mutation differences. Yep, so that means your changes in your DNA. And an important part of that too is that it's not like the parent mouse is like, oh man, living on dark rock now. Let me have offspring that are darker furred because that's going to be better and they're not going to die, right? So that's why they can't control that aspect of it. So we would call them random mutations because they just happen because when DNA is copied, there's mistakes made. The machinery, the proteins that copy DNA to make new DNA that ends up being in the eggs or sperm, they are not perfect. Pretty good, but they're not perfect. Which is important because if it was just perfect every time, everything would just stay the same. There'd be no differences, and so there would be no evolution, and that would be problematic for species survival. Okay. And so it's also not just changes in any DNA during any copying. It has to be during the copying that's going to make reproductive cells, because this has to affect the baby. So like mutations in your skin can be consequential for you, but they're not going to be consequential in an evolutionary context because they don't affect the next generation. There's got to be mutations during the copying of the DNA when those reproductive cells are being made. In animals, those are going to be the eggs and sperm. In plants, eggs and sperm, also spores. We generally talk about things in the animal context in Bio 1, just for simplicity. But if you take Bio 2, you'll note that there's actually some differences in this, but the basic process is the same. Okay, so that's how you get that variation to begin with, and that's important. So we have what we call alleles. This is a perhaps new word, which are versions of a gene. That's what an allele is, and we'll use that word. I just want to introduce it now. In this context, we've got new alleles arise, right, from the mutations. And that creates one thing that has to be in the case for any kind of evolution to occur. This is change, so you have to have variation, differences in the population, like I said, or everything, there is nothing to change to. It's all clones, which is not always a bad thing. If, if things are working well, environment's stable, not a bad thing to have just clonal populations. But if things start changing, that's when you kind of want this diversity. Heritable, not S. And this is in a population that you have this variation, right? In the mouse scenario, the initial population's living on the sand and it is light. So that's the original. So often we call the original the wild type. Wild type. Is wild type better or worse? No, nothing. I mean, just is what it is. It's the original version. So we've got the wild type gene, and then this mouse that has light fur has some offspring, and the offspring has variations, and some of them have a little bit darker fur. Why is that? It's a mutant gene version. So let's say allele, mutant allele. This is also, so it's really the wild type allele of the same gene. Just let's call it gene X. So wild type allele of gene X, we've got the mutant allele of gene X, same gene. That's important to recognize. And that gives the mouse a little bit darker fur. And what we'll do here is we can write this as X. This is X starred. May not use that, but star is, or the asterisk is often mutant. Usually that's what that means. So now we have that heritable variation. All right, so then what happens? So we have, and this is happening all the time. It's not like just when the lava came, there are darker mice. The babies are born with fur variation all the time. It just, usually doesn't matter as far as like becoming more common because they're either not different or doesn't have any selective pressure. So you wouldn't expect it to become more common unless there's something going on in the environment. So then the second thing that we're looking at here, some sort of selective pressure.
Yes. Would selective pressure be like where certain genes get passed on because they're more useful than others?
So that would be a consequence of the selective pressure. So what would be making it more useful or advantageous? That's what we're looking at first. There's got to be something in the environment that's making a difference. But yes, we're going there. Gina, what's an idea?
Is it because the predators keep finding them and eating them?
Okay, and in the mice, that's what's going on here. So one thing that might be a selective pressure are the predators getting eaten. Or if you're a plant herbivore, maybe something like getting mates, because it has to reproduce, right? The ability to get mates better than others, whether it's competition like fighting it out, getting mates, or being attractive to being mated with, something like that. So some might get mates better than others or more easily than others.
Like food and resources.
Okay, so you got to eat. So besides not getting killed and making babies, you have to get some sort of food in, whether it's in a plant doing photosynthesis more effectively, maybe you absorb more sunlight. And so that makes you be able to make your own food, or if it's physically going and getting something to actually eat. You can also include water in here for many organisms, most organisms. And maybe not just food, but maybe it's a certain nutrient, specific one. And it doesn't even have to be better at getting it. It could be better maybe at processing it. Maybe some versions of the organism are better at breaking down something that's useful or than others. So it doesn't even have to be like the action. It can be an internal body process that is differential. What about like literally having somewhere to live? If there are too many organisms in one spot, then only some of them are going to be able to have that space. This is a useful phrase, and I have you write, usually I have an essay about this on the exam where you have to tell me about the process and come up with your own example, realistic example. And you'll notice too that this is all in the same organism, or the same species, I should say, same population. So we're not talking about, a mouse versus a bunny rabbit. Even if they're in the same environment, we're talking about all the mice and just versions of that mouse. So that sometimes people talk about, they want to say like, well, rabbits were lighter fur on the desert or in the snow, so they survive better than the mice. And they're talking about two different things, but in this case, they all have to be mated together in order for this to happen, which means they're the same species. Okay. So the third thing we have is differential. This is the fancy way of saying it. Survival. And this is usually what people think, just the survival part, but that in itself is not enough. So that's not just surviving, it's also making offspring. So it's important. That's maybe the most important, is the making the babies. So individuals with a selective advantage, certain characteristics, which are caused by the alleles. So the alleles lead to the characteristic. We could also say if they have a selective advantage, they are better adapted to the environment. SNR is survive and reproduce. So they survive and reproduce more often than other individuals in that population without those characteristics or that characteristic. And then when, like we said, once that we say characteristic, we also really mean with those, without those, or with those alleles, right? Or allele combination. It might not just be one thing, it might be a combination of genetics you need to get some sort of phenotype or outward or characteristic that's advantageous or not. So, and you notice too, it's in that environment. So there's nothing like, there's no intrinsic per se better or worse characteristic. Even something that kills the organism might actually not be a disadvantage overall, like sickle cell anemia, disadvantage for individuals that have full sickle cell. But when it's a combination of sickle cell and a normal allele, a normal version of the gene, you get this in-between phenotype, which makes you resistant to malaria. So even something that seems like, well, this must be a disadvantage, depends on the environment, whether it is or not. And you see that in the mice, right? There's nothing particularly better or worse about a fur color. It depends where you live. So let's talk about the mice. So it's going to be a new environment.
Oh, the rocks became much darker because of the lava.
Okay, so we got lava flows. They hardened and darkened. So now they live. And this is not because the mice elected to live there or not. And they had to test that out, actually. So, you know, mice or any organism may have a preference for a certain area, but in this case, there was no preference. They just ended up on the rocks or didn't. And they see that even today, it's not like the dark mice go to the rocks and the light mice don't. It's just wherever they're born, they stay. Okay, so new environment. You got the dark lava rock. You got the selective pressure of the predators. So which, once it's in the dark lava rock, which babies or versions of those mice are better adapted? The mutant mice. And that mutant would be the dark fur. So mutant isn't bad, it's just different. Would have been the babies that are darker fur are also born on the sand, but in that case, not an advantage because it's a different environment. So the mutant mice with the dark fur are better adapted to the lava rock environment because they don't get eaten. In this case, because they survive more, longer, not all of them might have the mutant allele, but a lot of those babies would, meaning they have dark fur, which means then they survive and reproduce better, make more babies than the other light mice with lighter fur, because those guys are getting picked off by the predators. And so we can continue that for generation. And you know, it depends on how strong the pressure is, how fast the population will shift. If it's like 90% of the mice are getting eaten that are lighter fur, that's a really strong selective pressure, so you'd expect the population to change relatively rapidly. It's just like a slight advantage, like, you know, 1% advantage, then you expect the population to change slower. Would you expect the light mice to completely die out? Depends on how strong that selective pressure is. And often, right, they're still making different furred babies. So it's not like it's gonna always have to have dark fur. There's still some mutations happening. But if it's strong selective pressure, you'd expect the mice to pretty much end up being dark on the rock. And it's not like a certain mouse had fur and it changed its color, remember? It's that they were born with that characteristic and then it's an advantage or not. Or it doesn't matter. A lot of things like aren't gonna make a difference. So now the mutant allele gets passed on more. Repeat that for generations. And eventually you have a population shift towards more of the adaptive characteristic and alleles, more individuals with those. So, and that's natural selection. It's not the only way the evolution change over time can occur. So other ways, throw this out there. This random chance or random events. So like random chance meaning if you flip a coin 10 times, you expect half and half heads, half tails, but it doesn't always come out that way. Right? There's some random chance in there, especially in a small population. Or random events like catastrophe, which can be like really big, you know, like the asteroid hitting the Earth and the dinosaur extinction event. Or it could be little, like a moose walks through, you know, a field and crushes a bunch of flowers, kills the plants, kills the plants. Or some you have, yes, okay, let me say that. And the catastrophe, though, it's not like there's survival because they're better or less adapted. The plants get crushed by the moose just because they get stepped on, not because the moose is specifically walking on the plants that are, white flowers instead of purple. The asteroid kills whatever's there that it hits, not because it's better or worse adapted. And so what that means is that you may end up with populations that are not as well adapted as expected, because like what's left is what it is. And it can shift the populations around, which can cause, that's a form of evolution that's not through natural selection. So there are things like that. So we can also ask, how do the alleles actually make a difference? And this is like a big idea for the whole semester or the whole session. And I'll introduce this word here, phenotype. So the idea is that molecular shape and characteristics like being positive or negatively charged, something like that, dictates its function of that molecule, what it can do, because it's a certain shape. So it interacts with certain things and doesn't with others. It can make certain reactions happen, but not others. Anything like that. It can breaks down more easily or less easily. Changes the cell or organism characteristics or phenotype. That's the phenotype, are those physical features, the characteristics. And how does that relate back to the alleles? The DNA sequence, the ATCG of DNA, is what ultimately dictates what shape the molecule is. So that's what the DNA code is. The DNA code results in certain shape molecules. So, which is like, so with the mice, the darker fur is from more pigment, more eumelanin dark pigment. Why do they get that? Because a molecule is a little bit different shape, the one that's getting a signal to make dark pigment. So you got one like this, and it makes a small amount of dark pigment. Then you got one like this, because the DNA sequence ends up coding for a different protein. It actually doesn't bind the off signal. And so it just causes more and more signaling in that cell. So now you've got a hair cell that's making more of the dark pigment because it's not getting the turn off signal as much. And so you get a darker furred mouse. And why is that? Just because that different shape of that molecule that is leading to the eumelanin on or off. So that's one thing. Often what you see is that DNA changes might not change the shape of the molecule itself, but may change how much, when, or where the molecule is made, which can lead to different phenotypes. May lead to differential survival and reproductive success, and so forth.